Here at the Sagicor Cave Hill School of Business and Management, located at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, we meet the needs of the upwardly mobile professionals. Our business school functions in an evolving global space where the need to have that competitive edge distinguishes you as a professional. Our academic curriculum offers a variety of programs that gives you that edge. We offer our students a doctorate in business administration. Then, there's our executive masters in business administration. Our Sagicor Cave Hill School of Business and Management is for you. Enroll now.
Good morning. Welcome to Friday webinars at the Business School, UWI Cave Hill. My name is Marjorie Wharton. I am the Strategic Business Services Director and Clinical Faculty with the Sagicor Cave Hill School of Business at UWI Cave Hill, and I am your host for this event today. Our topic is creating a psychologically safe workplace. The psychological well-being of employees is a vital concern for organizational leaders all over the world. What does it take for organizations to develop their employees, to help them feel comfortable and capable of consistently performing at a high level? Our presenter, Dr. Sheri McKillop, will be addressing some of those questions for us today. During this webinar, she will discuss the organizational factors that contribute to psychological health, highlight some of the challenges of implementing the standard for psychological health, and explore some of the situations that can present themselves to co-workers and managers trying to achieve the psychologically healthy workplace. As always, this webinar is scheduled to run for an hour and 15 minutes. As the discussion progresses, please feel free to ask your questions as well. On your screens, you will find the control panel, which will give you an option labeled Q&A. You may use that at any point during the webinar to submit your questions to us. You can also feel free to use the chat feature. As we go along, Dr. McKillop will try to answer as many of those questions for you as time allows. So let me tell you a little bit about our presenter. Dr. Sheri McKillop is the Vice President Academics at the University of Fredericton. Sheri's passion for online education led her to this role that combines a love of business and a passion for education. The University of Fredericton is a fully online university delivering MBA, EMBA, health and safety certificates and diplomas, and most recently, programming in psychological health in the workplace. Sheri oversees all academic operations of the university. Sheri began her career as an entrepreneur, having started, grown, and sold 2 successful companies. She then became Chief Operating Officer of a textile and technology company before moving into academics. Sheri has held dean position at a community college and been dean at university prior to becoming the VP of academics. In addition to her entrepreneurial and business experience, McKillop holds a Bachelor of Home Economics from Mount St. Vincent University, a Master's of Business Administration from the University of Fredericton, and a Doctorate of Business Administration from North Central University. So welcome to you, Dr. McKillop.
Thank you, Marjorie, for that wonderful and very flattering introduction. I always feel like I have to live up to a lot more when those introductions happen. And thank you all for taking the time today to join us for this webinar. I'm speaking to you from beautiful downtown Fredericton, which is in New Brunswick in Canada, so I bet I have a lot colder temperatures than a lot of you do. I'm going to start sharing my screen here so that you can see my presentation, and we'll get started. Great, so this is beautiful downtown Fredericton, as I mentioned, and University of Fredericton is located here, although we have a physical presence from a business perspective. We do not have a campus. As Marjorie mentioned, University of Fredericton is fully online. That used to be a real distinguishing factor, but these days everybody seems to be going online, so it's interesting times indeed. What I want to talk to you today is about psychological health in the workplace, and I'm speaking from the lens of an educator as well as from an employer. I am not a health expert. I am not a psychological health expert, but I have worked with many experts and subject matter experts in this area to help develop programming and help look at the Canadian landscape. So what we're going to cover today is just a little bit about what is psychological health. And I'm going to talk a bit about the Canadian landscape. Canada has been a leader in the development and implementation of standards around psychological health. I'll speak a little bit to that. And then what today's workplace looks like and what the standards look like in today's workplace, what that means to employers, and a little bit about why you should be even thinking about this way, thinking about the psychological health of your employees and coworkers. So the Canadian, the psychological health and safe workplace has been defined by the national standards of psychological health and safety in the workplace as a workplace that promotes workers' psychological well-being and actively works to prevent harm to workers' psychological health, including negligent, reckless, or intentional ways. So in Canada, I'll give you a little bit of perspective here, and these facts are not unique to Canada by any stretch. And as more and more countries turn to looking at the psychological health of their workers, you will start to see, I think, a lot more statistics coming through and working forward as this becomes more and more of a recognized, not only a business problem, but a societal problem. So currently in Canada, 1 in 5 workers will miss time due to their psychological health. And that equates in the Canadian economy of 51 billion in lost revenue. And that's a large economic, and I should say, of course, these were all statistics that were done last year in a study. I'm sure that the lost revenue today is even higher. Being in isolation, not being able to socialize with friends, not having those social outlets for situations can also lead to the psychological health challenges. And one of the biggest challenges in dealing with psychological health, and this is certainly not unique to Canada, is there are stigmas. There are, people's attitudes towards saying, I don't feel psychological well today, I'm going to take a day off. That creates what some would deem as weakness or the inability to do your job, and therefore may be looked upon as a lesser employee and not considered for promotions or not considered a reliable resource for a company. And that stigma prevents a lot of people from talking about it and therefore increasing the lost revenue because it's just sort of swept under the rug. And I put up Bell Let's Talk here, and I don't know if, if anybody has heard of Bell Let's Talk. Bell is a multinational, but primarily in Canada, telecommunications company that owns significant television, radio stations, cellular networks, that type of thing. And 10 years ago, they started a program called Bell Let's Talk that in the last day or second last day of January, they encourage people to text, tweet, call someone, post on Facebook, post on social media, anything to do with reducing the stigma of mental health and increasing mental health awareness. They've raised millions and millions of dollars by doing this, but most importantly, they've had some significant results in people just being willing to talk about it. They've had celebrity endorsements, which increases the comfort zone around people wanting to or talking about their mental health. We have strived as an institution to try and encourage people to talk about these things, but it's not always easy for lots of people. But Bell Let's Talk has done a really great job of reducing that stigma and increasing the awareness. So in 2013, a group of experts came together to develop the Psychological Health and Safety Canadian Standards. Now, these go in with the CSA Standards of Occupational Health and Safety and are a non-mandatory guideline. They have not yet become a mandatory implementation in Canada, although there is a lot of effort in moving towards that. A number of larger companies and very high-profile companies have adopted the standards and made them part of their operating systems. The standards were developed on a plan, do, act, check, act management system, so something that is iterative and you put into place, but you're constantly observing and looking at the process, the results, and how you can improve. And currently, the ISO standard is being developed. This will be a worldwide standard, and it is being developed based on the Canadian standards. Canada is currently the only country that has a standard in place for psychological health and safety, and have become recognized as a world leader in that area. And so a lot of other countries are using the Canadian standards as a guideline to how they can either develop their own standards or implement them as is. And so when the ISO started developing the standards, they are working with the Canadian experts as well as UK, Australia, and an ISO standard is being developed and hopes to be launched by 2021-2022, which would be a worldwide standard and have consistencies across different countries. So I want to talk a little bit about what these standards are and what it actually means to have a psychologically safe workplace. And I apologize for the amount of words on the slide. I don't usually like to, but it really is. It comes down to the 13 social factors that are in play in the workplace that it can either enhance your psychologically safe workplace or take away from it. So if something is not working well, it can add stress, add confusion to your staff, and not have them fully understand why they might not be experiencing a psychologically healthy workplace. So I'm sure that some of these will generate some questions in the Q&A, but as I run through them, I want you to reflect a bit on how you could see some of these being implemented in your own workplace and what the challenges are. Usually when I work with a group and have this talk and this presentation, we do some time after this to break out and have a discussion around how you could see, what you think might be the most difficult one to implement and why in some cultures. So I'm just going to run through them. I won't rush through them, but think about that as we're going along. So psychological support. That does not necessarily mean you have to hire a psychologist to be on staff. It means that in your workplace settings, there has to be an outlet for your employees, your coworkers, to be able to speak to someone who can offer them some support or at least some direction to resources that might help them. Again, that person doesn't have to be an expert in this field. They have to understand what resources are available and how employees can utilize those resources. And I should actually add, these are in no particular order, that one is no more important than the other. However, they all tend to lead into one another. So if you start implementing these, they start to blend. The second one is the organizational culture. And that speaks a bit to what I was talking about with stigma and the ability to speak openly about psychological health. So if your culture is very non-progressive and doesn't encourage personal feelings or discussions of any type, you're not going to have an open environment where employees are going to feel psychologically safe. We've run through all of these at University of Fredericton, and we strive to implement the standards in our organization. It's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. We'll talk a little bit more about the challenges further on, but as we go through this, I'll provide you with a few examples of what's happened at University of Fredericton when we have implemented these. The organizational culture, we have taken and strived to implement wellness days for our staff. So when our staff are feeling less than, or having a bleh day and they just want to not work and they just don't have it in them to go to work that day, they have the ability to take a wellness day. They're not sick. They don't have to stay inside. They can go out, they can go for a walk, they can shop, they can, maybe in a couple of months they can do all those things. But, they have the ability to utilize those wellness days in a way that allows them to be culturally open about their psychological health. The next factor is the clear leadership and expectations. So without the leadership buy-in to this, it's never going to happen. And the expectations that the leadership supports the implementation of all of these factors and cultural type efforts. So, from our organization, we speak from a president on down of the university to openly speak about psychological health and ask people how they're doing and really ask for an answer, not just a "I'm good" type thing. That leadership, without that buy-in, you can't walk the walk and not, or you can't talk the talk and not walk the walk. So if we are saying that education in this area is critical, then we have to believe that and practice it as well. The next factor is including civility and respect for your fellow coworkers, your employees. And I often equate this to, as you have younger employees or older employees and you have conflicts, and lots of times people don't necessarily like everybody in the office place. And the larger an organization gets, that's always an issue. But it doesn't mean you can't always be civil and respectful to everybody. And that is as simple as saying hello in the morning. We had a report from someone that had taken some courses with us that was managing a shop and was really having some cultural and personality conflicts with a coworker. And as they were learning about the social factors and discussing the civility and respect, they realized that they were equally as non-compliant in treating that coworker in that way. So rather than always waiting for a conflict to arise or a way that staff didn't get along, this particular person made the effort to walk by the other person's desk every day and just say good morning. And that level of respect and just common courtesy is another way to put it, opened up some lines of communications for those coworkers that weren't there before and made both feel better in the long run. Psychological job demands. And this does not necessarily mean that your job is hard and it makes you think a lot. A lot of people indicate that without clear definement of roles and what is expected of them, they feel stressed about their job. So they feel like if you haven't been given guidance, training, if you haven't done or you don't fully understand what is expected, that can add to an increased level of stress. And that sort of leads to the next one, which is growth and development. So by providing opportunities to your staff to learn about their job, to grow, to advance to other levels of the organization, or even personally advance, those social factors can increase somebody's safety and their perception of their psychologically safe workplace. And the next one follows right after that, recognition and reward. So when someone is doing a great job, it's really important to have that recognition and reward. And that can vary depending on not only the organization, it can depend on budgets, it can depend on the person that you are recognizing or rewarding. Some people don't want to have a big deal made about what they've done and accomplished. They really just wouldn't mind getting a quick note or a thank you card or a pat on the back, either virtual or in real time. So the importance of recognizing your employees and what they're doing. Involvement and influence is all about being involved with the employees and using your coworker or your management experience to help influence the workplace in a positive way. Workload management comes down to what I've mentioned earlier about knowing what is expected and what isn't expected from a worker and how they can manage that workload. Sometimes people are afraid to speak up to say, I've got too much on my plate right now, because they feel it makes them look unable to complete their job, inability to complete their job, that they need help is a weakness. But if you don't have the conversations about the workload and the workload management, there is a strong opportunity for burnout, for people to get overwhelmed, for mistakes to be made. It's a very important factor in understanding the work environment. Employee engagement, how you engage your employees at work. So whether or not it's social activities or it's recognition and reward activities, but all of those things involved with an employee feeling engaged at work. An employee who feels engaged at work allows the openness of communication. It allows a flow of information. And again, engagement in a workplace can very much vary on the workplace itself, what the social activities are, what the non-social activities are that are just building rapport, building interactivity. Work-life balance. So while it's not the employer's responsibility to necessarily ensure that work-life balance is appropriate, they have to allow for it to happen. I know myself, for example, I tend to pick up my laptop on the weekends. That's just what I do. It's me. That's my choice. That it does not mean that the people who work with me or report to me should be expected to respond to anything that I write over the weekend. And I make that very clear in the working environment. I may write you an email because it's my choice to work. I certainly don't expect anybody to respond. In some countries, after work emails have been banned to allow employees to feel they do have an ability to disengage from work. That's becoming increasingly challenging right now with so many people working from home. It's hard to know where the home life starts and the work life ends. So you really have to make an extra effort to ensure your staff are feeling they do have that balance. A lot of times when we think about psychological impact, we really think about the effects of psychological, like of violence in the workplace, bullying and harassment. Those are by far very, very important things an employer has to make sure there are policies in place, there are ways to avoid it. And it is, as I said, one of the things we often first think about, not all the others, but however, it is just one of the 13 social factors, showing how important it is that they're all looked at. And the final one is protection of physical safety. You can't be psychologically safe if you're not physically safe. So if your employer doesn't take the time to ensure physical safety, there's been a lot of discussion here in Canada right now about personal protective equipment and whether or not there's enough around for those frontline workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the stress of going to work without personal protective equipment skyrockets. You know, when you feel you are not safe at work, it's hard to perform. So in a nutshell, a very big nutshell, those are the 13 social factors that go along with, that are all about what the Canadian standards are based on and the things you'd have to consider in implementing the standards. I know that slide was a bit long, so I'll try and move along a little quicker. But why should you pay attention? Why are those factors important? For every 5 employees, 1 is in a state of crisis at this very moment. So if you're looking around at your employees and you think 1 is in crisis, that's a loss of production. And human capital is the biggest investment an organization usually has. And if you think about a manufacturing plant, you wouldn't let a piece of equipment fail, so why let your employees fail? And most importantly, while there may be 1 person in a state of crisis at the moment, it's not about the fact that it's just that 1 person. So you may think, okay, I'm going to create an organization that allows that person to stay at home, or an organization that allows somebody in crisis to come to work but help protect them. But how does that employee perform? Are they paying attention to their details? If they're in crisis, are they thinking about something else? Are they affecting other people in the organization with negative attitudes, with their productivity, affecting other people? There's a lot of implications of even just that 1 person not being able to perform at peak capacity. And so some of the things you need to consider if you were looking at implementing the standards in your workplace is it's a top-down activity. So if you don't have buy-in for this from the senior leadership, it's not going to work, because unless the senior leadership understands what this looks like and what the social factors are and support it, change can be very, very difficult. It can also be difficult when you have diverse populations in a workplace. For example, culturally, many people look at psychological health from very different perspectives. So if you have many cultures in a workplace, what may be fully acceptable to one is not to another. You have to ensure confidentiality. If people speak out and they feel it's not going to be private or respected, they will stop speaking out. So that's a critical importance. You have to be able to identify the hazards and risks. I'll speak about that in a second. And preventing crisis as opposed to dealing with it is a really great sort of attitude to have in the plan, do, check, act mentality. If you're seeing these coming and you can prevent it, that is a lot more healthy than having to deal with a critical event. However, you have to be prepared. And you want to collect data and monitor situations, and as well training and education. So just to give you sort of a landscape of the Canadian marketplace, in 2012, Great-West Life, which is a large health and life insurance organization, did a Canada-wide survey which showed that 70% of employees have psychological health and safety issues. And by implementing the standards, they can increase motivation, and they can reduce the cost of, or the reports of, exhaustion and frustration. So when I spoke earlier about workplace and workload management, 25% of employees show that no matter how much they did, it wasn't good enough for their managers. So back again to the recognition and reward. And 60% of managers said dealing with conflict is the most stressful part of their job. So anyone who has managed people knows that, there's that great 80-20 rule, that 80% of your time is spent on 20% of the issues. And I'm sure anybody who manages people knows that dealing with conflict, either with yourself and someone else or between other employees or departments, is definitely a psychologically draining activity. So if you are thinking about implementing psychological health standards in your organization, one of the top recommendations is to take a change management process. So you can't bite off the whole thing and just say we're going to implement the entire set of 13 psychosocial factors and the methods to improve them in our organization. You have to have a change management process. Slow and sure, celebrate wins, look at the change management, look at your baseline, look at what your goals are, and utilize a change management process. If your company has an OHS committee, Occupational Health and Safety Committee, you can certainly utilize that committee. If not, it might be time to establish one. Create policies, as I mentioned before, leadership buy-in, and identify your current hazards. So what does your workplace look like right now that might indicate that it isn't the most psychologically healthy workplace? You know, how high are the stress levels? How often does change happen in your organization? Change can be incredibly stressful for some people. How are the demands of the job? How is your current outlook of work-life balance for your employees? What do you do to support that? You know, what levels do you have appreciation recognition? Is there any bullying going on, whether it's virtual, you know, emails that make people feel bullied, or if it's, you know, department-wise, is it, you know, how if you have a customer-facing or a stakeholder-facing business, how often do you have to deal with cranky customers? Anybody who's had the person on the other end of a phone or the other end of a counter yelling at you, nobody goes home feeling well after a day like that. And are there jokes about mental health? You know, do you tolerate jokes and conversations that maybe belittle the concerns of others, belittle the stress levels of other jobs? So those are all things to have a look at in your current workplace and see what's there and how you may be able to identify these things and help remove them in your workplace. So some of the challenges that you'll be faced with if you're looking at implementing a workplace, you know, a best practices is, again, the leadership commitment, understanding change management. And as I mentioned, sometimes change is not easy for a lot of people. So if you start changing things like, you know, the tolerance for jokes, you know, some people will say you're uptight and you don't have a sense of humor. And, you know, so it's really important that communication is there and that you are telling people why these changes are in place. And while you have to have the leadership commitment, you have to have employee buy-in. So it's great to find a couple of really wonderful champions for this activity in different areas of an organization and bring them into the process of implementing this so that they are speaking the employee's language. And as I mentioned, creating a baseline and the things to start looking at once you start implementing to see if there is any effect is things like your levels of absenteeism, your turnover, your short and long-term disability. If you have an employee assistance program, an EAP, does the use go up or down? Up is not a bad thing because it means people are talking to someone. Are conflicts reduced? Grievances, human rights complaints, all those things are results that may not have, you may not be able to equate to the bottom line directly of a business, but anybody who has worked in an organization where you know you have a high turnover level, just the cost and time involved of replacing employees. So if you can reduce turnover, that's a huge advantage for your company. And ultimately, you want to have, you know, high productivity. You want to, of course, have financial performance. This helps with risk management. Your risks go down when your employees are staying around. And it helps with recruitment. If you become known as an employer who respects and protects their employees, your organizational brand increases and you're more likely to have a stronger recruitment, retention, and employee satisfaction level. So I'm just quickly going to talk about UFRED as an educational organization. We partnered with Dr. Jody Samra, who's the lead psychologist for developing the Canadian Standards, to develop the training that we have. And what we've tried to do was create a training that would be something that was applicable to an entire organization so that it could reach everybody from frontline workers to senior leadership. So we looked at developing training programs on enhancing workplace resiliency. So that's really more about when you're already in a workplace that's not as psychological health and you have challenges, and how to build up employee resiliency. And that's a short course that can be delivered to almost everybody in an or can be taken by everybody in an organization. At University of Fredericton, we actually use it as one of our onboarding tools. So as new people come on, we have them take this course so that everybody has an understanding of what we're trying to achieve in the organization. They can have a common language that's shared amongst, you know, for conversations around psychological health. The second course is a basic psychological health in the workplace. It's an introduction to the standards, like I talked about the 13 social factors, what it means in an organization. Again, that's a basic course that can be delivered throughout an entire organization. The next level we looked at was a manager's certificate. So anybody who has a management or leadership role, who oversees people, or even is a coworker who has sort of a non-formal management role, but people tend to be the go-to people. This course talks about, all in the basics, the standards. It talks about emotional intelligence, recognizing some of the key factors that are going on in a workplace. And it also has the key principles involved. It gives a manager some techniques, some language, some principles that they can put into place when dealing with psychological health issues, when they can have the tough conversations, when to have those tough conversations, and when it really is time for someone to not be at work. Maybe it's a conversation to enhance that, and what return to work looks like. And the advanced certificate is really targeted as the champions in the whole organization that are going to implement the Canadian standards or implement the standards. It looks at the guiding principles for the standards. It looks at planning, what the planning of implementing the standards in an organization would look like. Again, things like change management, stepped implementation, and then the implementation process, how that runs, guidelines of looking at the factors, and then finally the evaluation, correction, and continual implementation, so that reviewing what's happening, whether it's working and whether it's not working. So I thought I'd leave you with this slide because there are lots of resources out there. Most of these are Canadian based, but again, this is all about having the resources to have conversations, to look at what is out there. So everything from label programs, Guarding Minds at Work. There's a European network for health promotion there, the Health Commission of Canada and the Government of Canada. And these are all free resources that you can use to read about it. And again, like I said, one of these will lead you to the Government of Canada Mental Health in the Workplace. You can look up the Canadian standards at the CSA website. It's quite an intense 150-page document. So I've really just hit the snapshot version of it here to give you an idea of what it is that you can do to help in your organization's psychologically healthy workplace. So I can leave this screen up in case anybody is trying to jot that down. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
All right, and thank you very much for that. That certainly was a very good, a lot more than just an opening shot. That was a lot of information that you shared with us.
And Marjorie, I'm happy to share the slides with you if anybody would like them.
Of course, we're already having that as a question coming forward. And so kind of you to mention that. We usually do make the resources available to our participants, so that's fine. One of the things that, as you were going through it, you were sharing with us really the fact that Canada is one of the first places that has been able to do this and has been able to establish these standards. And then you mentioned that there's also an international standard being developed. And I know that there have been some discussions with bodies in the region to really start to have those same kinds of conversations in the Caribbean. I don't know if you can perhaps tell us where those are at and perhaps where some of those plans are for making this awareness greater in the region.
Sure. I know I've been working with Reginald Thomas to look at ways that we can have the awareness level increased in terms of access to programming that can be rolled out at a significantly reduced rate so that we can promote awareness, because that is the goal here. We've been in conversations with University of West Indies to just have opportunities to come together in a partnership that would have these resources made available. I personally think that while they are Canadian standards, they're fairly generic in the sense of workplaces. Some of them, as I mentioned earlier, might be more difficult in certain cultural areas as opposed to, more progressive areas. You never know what you're dealing with from employer size and conversations that were going on like that. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Marjorie, or?
Yes, that does. And certainly just to mention that Reginald Thomas actually works with the Social Security organizations of the region. And so that's really where that conversation right now is starting. And I am aware as well that you have been in discussions with the university as well to make these programs available.
Yeah, it's really, we've really identified the Caribbean as a sort of at a prime position to start thinking about this. It's becoming, the stigma is starting to reduce, so there is conversations around it. So if you can move towards, formalizing what that looks like, across, the Social Security system, it can tie in quite nicely.
Yes. And of course, Social Security is looking at it because, as you mentioned, there is a cost associated with employees being psychologically unwell and therefore not feeling comfortable at work. So absenteeism, turnover, and so on. And the intention is really to ensure that employees are feeling a lot more comfortable at work and therefore comfortable enough to be productive and be happy to contribute not only to the workplace, but just to feel well within themselves.
Absolutely. So, and as I mentioned, that they're not affecting other coworkers when they're at work feeling that way.
Absolutely. So you mentioned the issue of stigma, and we do know that stigma around mental health issues is there's a lot of that in the region. So much so that people are not comfortable with talking about the fact that they don't feel well. And the concept of someone wanting to take, quote unquote, a mental health day is not really something that's practiced a lot in the region. So sometimes a person may wake up, as you mentioned at the opening, feeling blah.
Yeah.
But that's not a legitimate cause for saying that you don't want to come to work. So people will say that they don't feel well, or they have a headache, or they just can't come in today. But it might just be that they're just not psychologically where they want to be. So with regards to stigma, I would ask you this: how is that being tackled? What are some of the things that perhaps has happened in Canada or other places internationally to tackle that stigma issue? And what have you seen work in terms of shifting it?
Right. So in Canada, I'll start there. The standards themselves have actually been widely recognized by all the HR, human resource associations across Canada, and have been utilized by them for a number of years now. So reaching into the human resources department in organizations has been incredibly successful because they're the champions for the employees a lot of times. And they can then approach ways of allowing employees to feel safe having conversations, whether they're ensured confidentiality or privacy. Even locating a private area to have conversations can sometimes be a challenge because not everybody wants to walk into the human resource management office and close the door, because that alone causes questions. So sometimes it's all about communication channels that helps that. I have seen a lot of the times that it really is, as much as we speak about top down, that if a leader of an organization says anything that is positive in the sense of recognizing and respecting mental health, it goes a long way in an organization. I know that myself, I have a number of direct reports, and every now and then you sort of get the feeling that someone is not quite right today, and you just, why don't you go home and take the afternoon off and take half a wellness day? And it can go a long way in them saying, thanks, my anxiety was really high today. I don't know why. There's not always a reason. That's the worst part, is that people feel that way and they can't even define why. They might be having a good day. So from a stigma perspective, and I mentioned Bell Let's Talk, that's a national initiative that has done a lot to reduce the stigma, so people talking about it. It's still very present here as well. I'd like to say that it's not, but it is. There are lots of organizations where I know I would call it a CLM, a career limiting move. If you said that, you weren't feeling psychological well today, you would be seen as written off. That would be it. That would be the end of your career in some organizations. And I think it's still going to take a lot more time. Internationally, I see that it's not quite as open a conversation. I think it's moving there, but again, it's really about reaching some, I think, strong figures that are willing to come forward and have conversations. I know, getting back to the Bell Let's Talk, they had some very well-known Canadians, from an Olympian to a television personality, Howie Mandel, the comedian, come forward as spokespersons. So people that other people looked up to and said, wow, if they can talk about it, I can talk about it. And they chose some really good representations, because, who would think an Olympic athlete is having a bad day and doesn't feel like training, or, that a comedian, someone who makes other people laugh for a living, isn't having the best day. So I think that having strong voices that will talk is probably the most influential way to start reducing stigma.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. And you mentioned as well in your comments, you talked about the role of the leader and the fact that the leader has to be addressing the topic to also be able to focus a light on it as an important one in an organization. What have you found, or what would you suggest could be some of the arguments that a manager, a management team could put forward to their leaders to help them to realize that it's important for that shift to happen in the organizational culture?
Yeah, I think it's about understanding. That's a great question. I think it's about understanding the leader's motivations. Some leaders are very bottom line focused, very, P&L, profit and loss, and that's the only sort of guiding sort of success measure. Others are far more people oriented. Are people happy in my, do I own a company where people like to come to work every day? So I think it's about understanding your leader and utilizing some of the factors that would speak to that. So if your leader is very based on profit and loss and it's the dollar value, it's actually doing some number crunching around what absenteeism costs a company. So, or did 3 good people quit last year because they weren't feeling safe in this workplace? And again, that might be part of getting some of your baseline information, is talking to people who leave and why they're leaving, and making that business case on a dollar and cents value. So for 3 people that left last year, it cost us 200 man hours to interview, onboard, and get somebody up to speed. It cost us X number of dollars for the job ads. It's those actually making and quantifying those topics to a leader. In other places, it may be more that you're speaking to the fact that a leader may really strive to be socially responsible. And what does that mean? And so by pointing out the opportunities to be a psychologically healthy workplace and a leader and someone who is recognized as a socially responsible and an employee-focused person, that is, that may be the argument. So I think it's really about understanding, if you can, your leaders and their motivation, and utilizing some of the different, like there's different ideas for a business case, whether it's, like I said, different areas as those arguments.
Okay.
I should say, sorry, I should add to that, like in the profit and loss, because a leader's going to recognize right off that there's going to be a cost to implementing some of these things. Not all of them, but some of them are like recognition and reward. Maybe the reward is going to have a budget line. So if you're using a profit and loss statement, you have to also look at whether or not the investment is going to pay off. So if you invest, let's for $1,000 in a reward system, how do you monetize the reward on that? Is the reward increased satisfaction? So, it's not as straightforward as saying, okay, this is in this column and this is in this column. It's really more of a holistic view, I think.
Okay. But what I'm hearing you say, though, that it really takes a kind of understanding and a willingness to dig into finding that information to really make that argument. And I think that's important, because for many of our organizations, many people assume that because the leader's not thinking that way now, that perhaps they can't make that kind of argument. And
That's
what I'm
right.
hearing you say is, it's not that simple. Don't assume that you don't have any leeway. Just try to find the best way to put the argument over to the leader.
Correct. And maybe that's even, I don't think any one person in an organization would be tackling this on their own. Maybe it's a couple of managers that are like-minded that can work together on a presentation. And, you may find that leadership is very open to, 10 of the social factors and not 3 more. Well, that's still a step in the right direction in my books.
Okay. We have a question coming in from the audience. You spoke about having defining roles. How can this be obtained if your supervisor is indecisive and new in the role?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a tough one. Especially when the supervisor is new. I mean, you put yourself in that role. It's hard to even understand what other people's jobs are and roles are in an organization when you're new. I think you have to be a little proactive and manage up. I think you have to take some responsibility to identify what you've been doing. It's a great opportunity to say, here's what I think I should be doing and what would help the company, and helping them define your role. So you can't always just sit back and wait for that to happen, especially, as the question asked, the person is indecisive. So let's help them make a decision and start putting together your own list of, this is my role. I need clarity if you see that this is my role as well. And if not, let's discuss what goes and what comes in. So I think sort of owning your own, owning the start of that communication is really important. And it can be a little intimidating, but if someone is new, it could be something that you're just doing to help support them in their new role. I wanted you to understand my role. And, most new leaders would meet with everybody and have those conversations about what do you do, what do you like, what don't you like, those types of things. But in this case, if the new leader is very indecisive and doesn't know enough, it may be well worth your time and proactivity to put together a document and go and have that conversation. Start the relationship off on a strong foot.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Now, you mentioned, in looking at the factors, you mentioned work-life balance as one of those factors that should be taken into consideration. Many organizations are not really set up to consider or to focus on trying to create that kind of work-life balance. And so indeed, many of their employees are feeling like they're on call 24/7. Now we're using, as you mentioned, working from home. Even before that, there were people who had to check their email because they have the company phone and they have the email on it. They're in WhatsApp groups. There's conversation going all over because they have contacts all over the world, et cetera, et cetera. What are some of the known consequences of an organization taking that approach and almost expecting their employee to be on consistently?
Yeah,
and
burnout.
to respond almost immediately when they see those kinds of things?
Yeah, burnout, employee burnout, of course, sounds like, a buzzword or a catchword, but it's not. And it's not an immediate response. Burnout can be a slope that once people get on it, it is quite dangerous in the sense that it can lead to inactivity or if employers don't respect that work-life balance and employees are expected, they start sliding down that slope. So that can result in sloppy work, inability to respond, or responding not in as the manager sees fit, which means that their status as an employee will probably be affected in that manager's viewpoint. So if I have 2 employees and one jumps on my emails every weekend when I answer, am I going to think more of that person? Some employers will. Others will say, stop, go have fun with your kids and, have a family dinner. It's really, I think, it's a tough call because it's going to be, again, it's not an easy one to implement. But if you can take small steps about expectations, what are your expectations on the weekends? Even again, back to defining the role of the job. If I know that my boss's expectation is I am going to check my email, then I need to say, look, I'll check it once a day on the weekends and I will respond. However, I will not check it I will not let it buzz in my pocket every 10 minutes. You may find that some employers just will not accept that. It's unfortunate, but it's true. And, it causes loss of jobs. It causes lots of good people to stop performing at their maximum, causes resentment. It causes family discourse for the rest of that employee's family, which can be even more dramatic. So, when you've got someone who's picking up their phone every 10 minutes at the dinner table, the spouse and kids aren't really impressed. So I think that, it is a bigger picture, that it's not just, and then that person comes to work on Monday morning feeling like they haven't had a break, so their performance is not up to speed. So it really is it is a performance-related expectation. And if you expect people to respond like that, you better have the process and the supports in place to deal with it.
Okay. So that raises for me, and I see a question coming up here in the chat as well about defining boundaries. How can you communicate those boundaries without creating job insecurity? I know that there are many times where an individual may not feel comfortable having that kind of conversation, as you've mentioned, because of that fear of the impact or how they're going to be perceived. Is there any suggestion on what they can do if they have that kind of, so if one individual is feeling that way, is there something they can do? Perhaps should they be taking the approach that, let's say, everybody in the department is going to have a conversation and present a united front? Does that work better? What are your suggestions on dealing with that?
That's a difficult question because, as this is a new sort of realm of what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, more and more of those conversations are easier to have, but there's still going to be lots of times that they're not. Yes, I think a united front always works well. I think of, a prime example I have in an organization was a team that had a manager who was making the whole team feel very belittled and useless and expecting responses. Any one of them alone had tried to come forward and was shot down pretty quickly and told that if they were ever do that again, that they'd be fired. Well, that's a pretty, for people that their job is their security and their lifeline and they may be the sole employer or sole money earner in a family, that's intimidating. Who wants to come forward again when you're risking your boss saying, one more comment like that and you're out? So they did come together. They spent some time talking as a group, as a team, about what it was, and they tried to express that in a way that wasn't entirely emotional. So sometimes the emotion, the anger, the disappointment, the frustration, the anxiety, all those things can come across in a conversation. They took the time to identify specific examples that indicated what made them feel the way they were feeling as a team, so that it wasn't one person, it was an entire team. They shared that with the manager, but they shared it with his supervisor as well. That was a difficult choice for them to make, but they felt the organization as a whole had the leadership that wouldn't approve that manager's activities. The activities or that management leadership style. They were right. That manager hid a lot of it, misrepresented a lot of things. So, it was a very productive activity and a lot of good came out of it. The manager was sent on some training, some sensitivity training, some leadership training, and the team probably was stronger in the long run because they all understood each other and they were a united front and they were there to support each other. And that had a very positive effect long-term on that team. It's, that there are not black and white answers to a lot of these questions. Unfortunately, we're dealing with human emotions and human response, which is always a challenge. But sometimes coming together as a team and allowing you to talk about these things hopefully, it's not always easy to talk about these in a non-emotional way, but if you can put facts on paper and present them, it sometimes resonates with someone who isn't as aware of what they're doing.
Okay, and that of course leads me to this point. What if there are managers out there who are or would like to be more effective in their role of creating a psychologically safe workplace? What perhaps should they be considering as they design their own development plan? Because there may be instances where some individuals they would like to do better, but they simply don't have the skills to do it. What perhaps should they be identifying as areas for them to work on to create improvement?
Right. Well, like I said, the list of resources that are up there now often have some very strong sort of guidelines on how you can move forward. Some of our programming, I know, is really more about leadership and managing in a psychologically healthy workplace, as opposed to just what it looks like. So how do you implement it? How do you recognize the factors? How do you recognize the symptoms? And what you can do from a management perspective. There are more and more of these resources coming out all the time, which is great. The more resources that are out there, the more likely that the conversations are starting to happen. Again, back to those 13 social factors, you can't tackle them all. I think it's important to have a few people in an organization that looks at them, and some of them may be easier for certain organizations than others. So in a manufacturing plant, maybe you already have a great occupational health and safety program that people feel safe in their job. And you can start with, polling employees to say, do you feel physically safe? Do you have the right professional protective equipment? Those types of things. Organizational culture, that's a huge one to bite off, because that's not just...
And maybe you can just go back to the slide with the 13 factors while you're running through them again.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great idea. So, things like organizational culture, that's the whole organization and the culture they have. You can't tackle that first. That has so many, like every organizational culture, there are just so many things that play into that, whether it's the area you work in, the departments, so many things. Maybe and civility and respect. That's one that's, I would think, easy unless you have people that have no desire to do it. So some of them, for some organizations, are going to be very easy. And I think as a leader, if you were looking at how to start, some of the resources that I mentioned before, but then going through this list and thinking, okay, well, some of these are manageable in my organization. I can see ways that I can improve these. These are not, these social factors are not a checkbox per se. They're not like, okay, I'm done with clear leadership and expectations. Check, we've got that one done. They're a iterative development, review, improve type process. So this will always be in play in an organization that's striving to be better. Workload management, as an organization grows and you redefine how the workload is looked at, you look at, are there different jobs that have to change? Are there job descriptions that have to change? So there are, this is not a quick implementation. I guess I should, go back to that and say that anything that an organization does and that you can accomplish in an improvement type cycle with any of these social factors helps employees. And it tends to be contagious in the sense that if you see small rewards and the wins that are happening by implementing some of these, it tends to be reinforcement to the staff, to other managers, to the leadership, that you can call out those wins, you can highlight them. You know what, great work, our absenteeism is down 1% this month. You know, it's small wins like that that can really make people sit up and notice and say, you know, oh, that's cool, we absenteeism down, you know, we made a difference, that's great. So, you know, work-life balance, that one's going to be hard to measure, because for some people, I have a coworker who would rather go work on the weekend than be at home. So it's whether it's a work-life or life-work balance, I'm not sure. But, you know, all of those things, it's a slow, steady process that if you're making changes, you're making any efforts to look at these social factors to have them improved in your organization, you're going in the right direction.
Okay. And so we have a question here from the audience. What are some of the effects if the company does nothing to try to, well, nothing as it relates to mental health?
I think, you know, from an extreme, I think about someone coming to work that is not in their, you know, at their best. Their mental health is in question. They're anxious, they're depressed, they have home life issues, and they are the engineer on a train, or they run a backhoe on a construction site. If they are not focused on their job when it's got other lives in their hands, that's the worst that will happen. You know, it's not something we like to think about, but you know, our mental health takes up a lot of space. And if your job is detail oriented, it has safety issues associated with it, that is going to be one of the highly bad things that could happen from doing nothing. If you don't do anything, there are horrible consequences in suicide rates. You know, I mean, that's one way to lose an employee is through suicide. Taking that to a step of losing employees, people quit. If it's too much, they just can't do it anymore. There's no respect, there's no reward, there's no, you know, upside to working someplace, they leave. And then you've got the expenses related to that. So, and, you know, if you don't do anything and you have that sort of atmosphere and it's an unhealthy, a very depressing workplace to be in, it's just not productive anyways. Even if people are doing their jobs, it's probably not operating at peak capacity. So, you know, everything from loss of life to loss of employees to the effects it has on other people's mental health.
And we know that in the region, there have been reports, there have been research projects and so on that has looked at the instances of absenteeism, the instances of employee engagement and so on in organizations. So we do recognize that that is an issue for many organizations out there. But as you mentioned, there are a lot of people who are in a situation that they assume it's normal and they assume there's nothing they can do about it because there is that fear of job security or job loss.
And that's going to be a slower road, I think, to pave in the sense of allowing people. It kind of comes back to the stigma as well. You know, it's all related. It's all tied up in that, you know, you're seen as weak if you say something. But, you know, hopefully every bit helps when we're doing this.
And now we are at a crossroad, an interesting crossroads, because having had the pandemic occur, where we've had people move out of their typical work structures, their typical work support structures, where maybe you walk down the hall and you see your friend at work and you have the opportunity to kind of shake your head together and talk about the crazy thing the manager said or the crazy idea the manager had. You now no longer have that kind of support. So people have moved out of their typical support structures. And so they still need to be able to function effectively. So what, if any, could be some suggestions for how to deal with the health, the psychological health of an organization when it's not really in the organization as it used to be?
Yeah, it's true. And I mean, really, you know, some employers would say that's not my concern, that's not my job. But again, if you're concerned about the company, it becomes a job. I know we have a check-in process with our employees right now where we will, weekly kind of check in on them, just, what's going on, not about work, but about, what are you up to? What are you doing? How's your mental health? How are you dealing with being at home, and whether you're alone or whether you have family? For some people, it might be easier to work at home. It doesn't mean you want to do it every day. And certainly not for us. I know we're in week 10 of working from home remotely here in Fredericton. So, but it's, I think the challenge here is that, like you said, there's no distinction. Are you at work or are you at home? And what is that? So check-ins with your employees, having people set up dedicated workspace that they can walk away from when they're not working is really important. Doing Zoom meetings where you actually see people's faces is great. We have at UFred, we have a Friday afternoon happy hour where the whole staff gets on a video platform and just has a chat and a few laughs, and it's great. We've started doing things, and I'm speaking personally because, right now none of us have experience in dealing with pandemics too much. But we do things like a lot of our meetings will start off with, when they're internal meetings, they'll start off with just kind of around the table, what's going well for you this week, what isn't, what can we help with? And they can be personal, they can be professional. Sometimes the frustrations of at home is even just slow file download from the office. And, how can we help improve that so that you're not anxious, you're not stressed about not getting your job done? That's helped us quite a bit. We sometimes just circulate games, puzzles, riddles, that type of thing, just to keep people connected. Because as you said, it's that connectivity that we're all missing right now. Our support systems within our job are a little more challenging to utilize. And so the support systems, trying to connect with people. We had someone start up a virtual coffee hour so that you were assigned a staff that you don't normally work with, and you had coffee with them over Zoom. And that way you got to know someone new in the office. So trying to think about what you would normally have going on in an office, and maybe is there any way to replicate that virtually?
Okay, and we have a question here. I think those are some very good responses that you have given, and certainly very useful in terms of how we can deal with keeping that connection at work. Yeah. We also have a question which came up and then for some reason just vanished off of the screen. Where someone was mentioning the fact that there's no work culture relationship between employer and employees in an organization, and they want to know what can be done to improve the situation.
No, that's a good question, and unfortunately it happens lots of times. It's from an employee perspective, that's a challenge because you really need a champion to help you with that has the conversations with the leadership team or the management team. I like to always tell my staff to manage up to me because I need that feedback and that communication, but a lot of people aren't open to that, unfortunately. I think sometimes I've found small steps, baby steps in dealing with that. Doing things in writing sometimes helps because it's just a little easier, respectfully, to write something, to read it, to ensure the message is going the way you want it to go, as opposed to sometimes conversations can get shut down really quickly if the person isn't willing to listen. So whether or not that's in your comfort zone to have that conversation via email, and maybe small steps, little things that you can see that could improve that might not be threatening to a manager, because sometimes people are just threatened because they're insecure in their own role. And if you're helping and not attacking or blaming, that can go a long way.
So it really says then that a manager has to be willing to take part of the responsibility to show that they are open. Because there are a lot of managers out there who may say, but of course my staff can come and speak to me. But whatever you're doing is not making your staff comfortable enough to feel that they can do that.
Right. So your actions and your words are not actually meeting. There's something in there that's stopping it.
Okay, so very good point. Very good point for us to wrap up on. I think we had a very good discussion. Okay, hold on. I think there are some additional questions that have just come in. We have one here. How should the leader deal with a manager who creates conflict in the organization?
Oh, great question, because it happens. I mean, there's always that one person that's niggling in, and again, I think it comes down to strong leadership and strong communication, that it won't be tolerated, that they need to find out from the manager what it is that they're trying to achieve by causing the conflict. I think it's important to have, when you're having those conversations, to have solid examples of what you see as. So if I'm the leader and my employee is causing conflict, I need to be able to articulate what that conflict is and what the results are and why it won't be tolerated. And I often try and look at all situations like that as learning opportunities. Maybe the person didn't know they were creating as much conflict as they were. Some people thrive on that. They thrive on the negativity and being the person that does that. So it really is about the leadership taking on the responsibility of saying that won't be tolerated. Here's what you've done. Here's what it's caused. Here's what I expect. So again, expectations and guidelines on how to get there. Taking it as a training moment or a leadership development moment. And eventually, if it doesn't improve, then maybe that person isn't a good fit for your organization.
Unfortunately, sometimes we have to make those difficult decisions.
Absolutely.
As well.
Absolutely.
And the second one is, how far should employers go in their attempt to ensure that employees are taking steps at home to ensure they remain mentally healthy, understanding that that is affecting their work performance?
Good question, because really the employer has no control over the home life. And, there can be all kinds of factors there, whether it's people who are dealing with, I'm caring for both my children and my parents at the same time. Maybe there's an abusive relationship. You just don't know what that is. But I think, again, it comes back to, while you have, as an employer, you have no right to oversee the home life, you can certainly have conversations that, empowering yourself to say to your employee, I noticed you're not yourself this Monday morning. How was your weekend? And, is there anything that we can do here that would help? Or, it's, again, opening those modes of communication, that you're not judging, you're not trying to influence their home life. However, you're there as a support. And whether or not that is, recommending them to other resources or just being an open ear sometimes helps greatly. But from an employer perspective, you really don't have any control there, except to be supportive when you can.
And that's an important distinction. I think it's not so much that the employer is trying to impose, but they're really offering support.
Correct.
For the productivity of the employee.
Exactly.
And our last question, how should you manage an employee who always has an excuse for not meeting their deadlines despite getting other staff to assist them?
Okay. So I probably would start by creating a document that documents all the excuses and the dates and the deadlines. And it's having that conversation with the person that says, you are not living up to my expectations. You are missing deadlines. While some of your excuses are valid, others are not acceptable in this work environment. It depends on, I had a staff member whose grandmother died 4 times. So, the excuse is which is why I started documenting. But, does that employee have the skills to do the job? Is this an excuse or a way to avoid the deliverable because they really don't know how, or they don't know what to do? So they're using a coworker to help with that, but it's taking longer, or they've procrastinated because they don't know. So sometimes it can be an opportunity for understanding that person isn't the right fit for that job. Sometimes it might be an opportunity to find that they need some training or some guidance or some upskilling to be able to meet those deadlines. So having that conversation is, why aren't you meeting your deadlines? what can I do to support you to meet those deadlines? What can I do in terms of resources to help you with that? Then you're kind of, you're circumventing those excuses before they happen.
Okay. All right, and we have one here skating in under the wire. Change of government often results in new management within state-run entities. How can these managers regain the trust of employees who previously were threatened with layoffs?
Oh, that's a good question. And that is a challenge, because you can have a complete new management team, leadership team that has a completely different outlook on how the organization should be managed. And I think I go back to what I said previously about an employee that was, trying to define your role, that it might be good for the employees there to say, here's what we've been doing, to use it as an education for the new government, the new team that's come in. Here's what we've been doing. Here's what we like. Here's what we don't like. Those kind of communications. Use it as an educational opportunity to help the new leadership, as opposed to combat or fight with them on what they believe. Have it as a, here's what I've been doing. Does these meet the expectations that you have for me in my role? Do they, or the department's role, or, and understanding that when whether it's new ownership, new government come into place, there's often a opportunity or the desire for them to put their own print on someplace. So being aware of that, but letting them know what you do currently can help, can assist you in helping to guide them.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we had a very good discussion. So thanks to all of you who were able to get your questions in, and we had the opportunity to respond to them. We've had the question whether or not the slides were going to be made available to you. They will be. We will email them to you after the session. We are going to also make available to you any responses to any questions that have not been answered during the session. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Our topic has been creating a psychologically safe workplace. Thanks to our presenter, Dr. Sheri McKillop, for a very rich and very enlightening session today, certainly sharing a lot of information with us and giving some great suggestions and ideas for tackling some of the issues that come up as we try to implement. For more information on the Sagicor Cave Hill School of Business or our programs, please visit our website, uwichsb.org. As always, we invite you to keep the conversation going on our Facebook page and reach out to us if you need any additional information or clarification. Hopefully, you will be able to join us for our next Friday webinar, when we will be discussing the topic, Coping with Challenges, Strategies for HR Managers. I look forward to seeing you then. Please continue to stay safe and stay sane and enjoy the rest of your day.
Here at the Sagicor Cave Hill School of Business and Management, located at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, we meet the needs of the upwardly mobile professionals. Our business school functions in an evolving global space where the need to have that competitive edge distinguishes you as a professional. Our academic curriculum offers a variety of programs that gives you that edge. We offer our students a doctorate in business administration. Then, there's our executive masters in business administration. Our Sagicor Cave Hill School of Business and Management is for you. Enroll now.